friends. You're listening to How the West Was Cast, a podcast dedicated to the best of the Western movie genre.
So I bought the land just past yours on the west.
Near the river?
That's right.
By God, I had my eye on that land. But I'm glad you bought it instead of that goddamn Western Cattle Company.
Who are they?
A couple of Eastern speculators. They bought 50,000 acres for raising cattle.
There are no cattle around here.
There will be.
Sheep and cattle don't mix.
No, they don't.
No, they don't.
Well, hell, I'm gonna miss you, Joe, but we'll be neighbors.
Don't crowd me, Frank.
Little Joe, you are the unfriendliest fella I ever met. And frankly, quite peculiar.
That was a scene from The Ballad of Little Jo, a superb 1993 Western written and directed by Maggie Greenwald. And on today's very special episode, we'll speak with Maggie about making that film and about her love for the Western genre. Hello, my name is Matthew Chernoff, and I'm a screenwriter and an entertainment journalist in Los Angeles.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, a film historian and the chair of the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah.
Now, before we continue, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find us at Western Podcast. That's at, as in the at symbol, Western Podcast, all one word. Tell us about your favorite 90s Western, and we just might discuss it on a future episode. Also, if you enjoy our show and want to help support it, the best way you can do that is by subscribing to it on whatever platform you use. Okay then, Andrew, when I first mentioned that I was going to approach Maggie about appearing on the podcast, I wasn't aware that The Ballad of Little Jo was a film that you were well familiar with, especially in the classroom. So tell me about that.
Well, The Ballad of Little Jo is, to my mind, the most unjustly neglected of the 1990 cycle of Westerns and probably the most deserving of revaluation. I think it does what many of the greatest Westerns do. It uses the genre to tell a new story and also fleshes out the stories of many of the genre's minor character types. I include the movie every time I teach my Western film course, offering the film as a kind of counterpoint to Unforgiven, which was released the year before. But I'm also able to put the film in dialogue with earlier Westerns with strong female characters, like the high-riding women played by Barbara Stanwyck. The film is always a big hit with students. I'd go so far as to say it's actually inspirational, giving them an idea about the types of Western stories that they could tell that maybe take us a little bit outside of the norm.
I can totally see why your students were so taken with this movie, because it really is something special. It's not just another replay of a familiar Western story that we've all seen a dozen times before. Instead, it's something quite unique. It's an ambitious character study that combines romance with adventure and melodrama and suspense, and it's filled with some truly gorgeous imagery. Now, for those who might not have seen the film yet, why don't you go ahead and offer just a brief summary of it?
That's a good idea. So as you mentioned, The Ballad of Little Jo was released to cinemas in 1993 amid the last genuine revival of the big screen Western. This was the period that saw the release of films like Dances with Wolves, Unforgiven, Tombstone, Bad Girls, Posse, and other movies. The film tells the story of Josephine Monahan, an Eastern society woman who's disowned by her family and decides to head west, where she reinvents herself in the most radical of ways, posing as a man. As we'll discuss, the film garnered its share of accolades back in '93, but was also controversial. Mainstream reviewers criticized, sometimes antagonistically, the film's purported deviations from tradition, while commentators in the alternative press and academia lamented that the movie was too traditional.
You know, I feel like this movie really is just waiting to be rediscovered. I was encouraged to hear that Maggie owns the rights to the film now. It reverted back to her at one point, which is a very good thing, because this is a work that clearly means a lot to her, as well it should. and hopefully more people will be able to see it in the future. I know personally I would love it if it screened here in Los Angeles at the American Cinematheque, because I think it would be a huge hit with that crowd. Its 30th anniversary is coming up in just 2 years, so who knows? A live Q&A with Maggie and Susie Amos and Beau Hopkins after the screening would just be incredible.
Especially if you and I were there to moderate it.
Hey, we can hope. Okay, then. I think it's time we say hello to Maggie Greenwald. Welcome, Maggie. It is a true pleasure to have you join us today on How the West Was Cast.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here with both of you.
Ballad of Little Jo is a film I have taught many times, always with great success. So it's a real honor to have you here today.
Oh, thank you very, very much.
So before we discuss Ballad of Little Jo, I'm curious to hear a little bit about your early introduction to the Western genre. You grew up watching them, I heard, and really loved the genre, right?
Yeah, my father loved Westerns, and he was a fanatic, and I watched them with him, and it's just part of the fabric I grew up with. And later on, when I was a teenager, I went to watch samurai films with him. He was a Japanese film fanatic, from early years after World War II, and my mother hated the films because they were so violent, so I would go with him. And so a lot of my, I think I loved them. If I didn't love them, I wouldn't have continued to go with him, but I always loved them.
A lot of people get introduced to the genre, I hear, from their fathers. It was my case as well, and we've had other guests on who said the same thing. It's sort of the gateway is the dads and Westerns.
Yeah, I did have a brother, too, who loved them also. But yeah, I'm the daughter who loved them as well.
What were some of the things about the genre that appealed to you?
A lot of things that actually, Andrew, you mentioned in your lecture yesterday. I always, the landscape is so beautiful, and I always really connected with the central myth of the rugged individualist kind of finding their way and finding their path and against the bad guys or convention. I found the films incredibly beautiful and exciting, and also did really connect with the themes of the mythic landscape, the primal search for self and identity in the world.
Mm-hmm. Were there key titles that stood out to you back then?
Well, the movies that made me the director I am today include The Searchers, The Wild Bunch, Once Upon a Time in the West, The Magnificent Seven, the top 10,
right?
That are really on everybody's list. There are others that I don't know as well, but that, have been significant. But McCabe and Mrs. Miller.
Oh, beautiful.
Which is a little later.
So you were watching those at a time, though, when there's kind of a growing criticism of the Western and its purported ideologies. Did that factor into your thinking at all? Because it sounds like you were really able to see yourself in those
No,
films.
it didn't, because I think I was too young, and I was not, I wasn't reading criticism.
Right.
I was just going to the movies.
That's a good thing.
To be honest. Yeah, it was the best thing. And, when we talk about Ballad, that sort of factors into, I was shocked at the kind of backlash against me when I made the film, because it never occurred to me I wasn't supposed to.
Right.
So I should have read all that criticism. I think it would have warned me that I was on thin ice, but I didn't. No, I just, that's where I found myself,
I will probably get into this later, but it's probably a good thing that you didn't, because I find Little Jo to be like a classic Western, which is, using when the genre was at its peak, it was about telling different types of stories in the West. It wasn't about telling a certain story over and over and over again. Yeah. So I'm glad you didn't read that stuff, because you ended up making a great Western.
Oh, thank you.
So when you began directing in the 80s, you were part of this new movement of indie women filmmakers like Susan Seidelman and Penelope Spheris and Martha Coolidge, who were doing this incredible work, really exciting stuff. So what was that period of filmmaking like?
I'm actually a number of years younger than them. So I sort of came in on their tail. I moved to Los Angeles when I was 20, and that was from New York. I grew up in New York, and that was kind of where I realized that my dream was to be a director, and kind of found myself. But then there was no independent film scene at all in LA at that time. The only thing was a kind of dying exploitation scene, and the emerging pornography scene were the closest thing to independent. And other than that, it was studio movies. So as I started writing and thinking about directing, I really knew I kind of needed to get back to New York. It was Seidelman to some extent, and Jarmusch. It was, and some of the regional filmmaking that was coming out that I knew that was where I belonged. But I was living in Los Angeles, so it kind of took me about 10 years to find my way and financing and a script and to get back to New York. But I knew that was really, more my community.
Your first creative instincts were in performance, I heard, but not necessarily filmmaking. So what was...
Well, that was naivete, and that was because nobody handed a 10-year-old girl a camera. Right? That's really simple. So I have early memories of like trying to stage stories in my room and like trying to get my friend to do it a certain way. Don't stand there, go stand over there. But I never understood that as directing. And I always thought, I just could see the actors, and I loved performance so much. And my whole family adored acting and performance in theater. So I went to drama school. I really didn't have any idea, even though my father was, passionate about movies, and I didn't connect the dots at all. And it took me until I was about 20, till I moved to Los Angeles, actually, to go, for the light bulb to go off. So I studied drama and dance for 10 years and studied acting. But, theater directing is so different. I didn't relate to that particularly at all. And I was never comfortable performing, but just kind of stayed the course because I knew there was something there. And in LA, you just go there and it's in the water. Right. I think like a week after I got there, someone knocked on the door and said, "My friend's casting extras in a movie. Do you want to be in the movie as an extra?" Like, sure. So, so I think within a year, I really understood that had really always been my dream, but I didn't have access to it as a girl.
Mm-hmm. And then the post-production audio work that you did on some huge movies like Trading Places and Weird Science and those kind of films. Oh, that crazy Michael Crichton movie, Runaway, which is so bizarre. How did that?
Yeah, it grew out of, as I began to learn about filmmaking, I fell in love with editing, and I was like, okay, I need to earn a living somehow. I don't want to work production unless I'm the director. Mm-hmm. I love editing. If I felt like if I could learn to edit, that I could be a good director. And so I went to work at Sun Classic Pictures. Andrew, that's for you.
Classy establishment.
You know them. I worked in their LA office as a runner, and then became their vault librarian. And then I got a job as an assistant editor at Alan Landsberg Productions. And he was really at the forefront of kind of reality TV and a lot of that, like this TV show In Search Of.
Oh, and yeah, I love that show.
Yeah. And I started out as an assistant on that and then became a picture editor. And again, within a short time, I loved editing, but I pretty soon realized, okay, you pick a career, directing or editing. I just needed a gig to make some money, So I had friends who had become successful sound editors. and they invited me to come be an assistant sound editor. So that became, a really wonderful job where I could earn a really, nice living for a young adult and work on my stuff.
Were you writing during that time period as well?
Yes, that's when I was learning to write and starting to write screenplays and, finding my way, coming up with what would be that independent film that I could direct eventually.
Now, after directing your first two features, Home Remedy and The Kill-Off, which I love, as a Jim Thompson fan, oh my God, was that an exciting time period when everybody was making those movies?
Well, I was first. Matthew.
Yeah. I was working at a video store when it hit VHS, and I had it on my employee's pick shelf for a year. It was great. I loved it.
I know, and it was never a corrected transfer either. It was just like a one-light transfer. I was just so sad. But thank you so much. No, I was first at that. I got in trouble for that too. That was my first foray into girls aren't supposed to do this. But I did it. How dare you? But I did it anyway. Yeah, I love that. I still love that movie.
Then you decided that your third movie would be a Western.
I felt I was ready. I was ready. Yeah.
And but you didn't have a story yet for it. So how did that evolve? Like, how did Little Jo originate?
Well, I did what I used to do when I was looking for a story. I went to the library. I just went to the shelf that was about history of the American West and started scanning, looking for something. And kind of at the bottom of the shelf was a book that was like Women of the West or something. And it was a collection of 2 or 3 page little things, little summaries of women in the West, and included some pretty dazzling people, all of whom should have movies made about them but haven't. And then there was just kind of a 1-page thing about Little Jo Monahan and the newspaper, and a reference to the newspaper article that was the obituary. And I went, there's my movie, there's my story.
Wow. I get a vicarious thrill when I think about you turning the page and finding that.
Me too.
Article, like that eureka moment. Yeah, wow.
And it really was. It was just like there it was, this obituary, and it was just, like 2 or 3 paragraphs. And I just went, there's my movie. Wow. I mean, I did go to the library knowing I wanted to make a film about a woman. Mm-hmm. That's for sure, that I didn't have any interest in making a film about a man. I knew I wanted to make a story about a woman.
Although that newspaper article is what kind of gave you the idea, the actual story that you came up with is entirely your own.
Correct.
Although people often seem to, when I tell them I'm going to talk to you about this, they said, oh, she made that biopic on Little Jo, and it's just not that.
And thank you for correcting them, because no, it's not. I mean, it's sort of ironic. I mean, the conceit of the whole film and my vision of it was that I was going to make a legend. Right, like, Wild Bill Hickok or Jesse James or, Wyatt Earp, that was kind of the whole idea for me. And but no, I made it all up, except for that there was a woman named Josephine Monahan, who did cross-dress and live a man in the West. And she was a society girl from Buffalo, New York, named Josephine Monahan, who did have a child out of wedlock, but everything else is completely fiction. So thank you for reminding them, because it really irks me a lot that people think it's a biopic.
I mean, in a way, though, you kind of succeeded, because
yes,
I mean, we know that the screen Wyatt Earp and Jesse James, what people think is the true story is not. It's based on films. So the fact that you created this legend based loosely in history, but now people think it is historical, suggests you actually succeeded.
I did. I completely succeeded. But if the film was more well known and I was more well known, I would have been able to tell everybody that I made it up. But I haven't gotten to do that. But I recently watched some of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and in the beginning of it, it says, some of what follows is true.
Yes.
And I'm like watching the movie, I'm going, nothing is true in this movie except for that there were 2 guys named Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and Ella, or whatever her name was.
Etta Place,
Etta Place, right. But that thing at the title at the beginning, based on a real life, actually the distributor made me put that in because he felt it would make it would pique people's interest.
Right. Well, people in Westerns certainly like this discourse of history. They like to think that, oh, this is telling me how it really happened. Yeah. Whereas you clearly absorbed a lot from those films you watched as a child when it came to myth making.
Yeah, I did. I learned good.
Now, since I know you really appreciate the work of Sam Peckinpah, is there any chance that the film's title was an ode to Cable Hogue?
Yes, it was, and thank you.
Beautiful. I love it.
You're going to make me cry. You're the only person on earth who ever knew that.
Well, now it's become commonplace. There was always Cable Hogue, and there was your movie, and now we get Buster Scruggs and Lefty Brown, the Ballad of. But it fits this film so much better.
Yeah.
It was my one of my homages to Sam. And casting Beau Hopkins.
Oh, well, yeah, we're going to get to him. We could do an entire show on Beau Hopkins.
We could.
I mean, so much more than Sam Peckinpah. He's been in so many great Westerns. So can you talk a little bit about the script writing process on this project? How long did it take and what kind of research was involved?
To be honest, it was one of those, I haven't had too many of those. I don't think anybody gets too many of those. It was just one of those sort of magic ones that I wrote the first draft in about 3 weeks.
Oh, my God.
It was a very crude first draft. It was, it was only like 80 pages or something. But I wrote surrounded by photographs. I still actually buy a lot of books and do a lot of visual research as I'm writing. I crave the images of, kind of finding the world that I'm building and want to create. So a lot of it was inspired by photographs. And so whenever I got to a spot that I needed an idea, I'd pick up the photograph, I'd pick up the books and start looking at the photographs. So a lot of it, really all of it is inspired by photographs.
That makes so much sense when you see, like, for instance, that image that's burned in my head of that mute prostitute being brought in on the donkey, and the way she's dressed, that looks like something that must have been like.
Well, not on the donkey, that I made up, but there was there was an image of a daguerreotype of, I guess, of a prostitute or early porn of a woman with that long hair, like Olinda, like we gave Olinda Tutura, that. There was that image, and then I kind of so it was just her, and I brought her onto the llama into the troupe that, with the, the man who brings her, or the pimp who brings her around. So the inspiration for that was the image of the woman from an early sex card, I guess.
So what went into the decision to shoot in Montana and set the story in Montana?
I knew pretty much that I really wanted to make a cool weather Western. I was more inspired visually by McCabe and Mrs. Miller. I felt that the story, that's kind of where I was seeing the story. I didn't feel like it was an Arizona, or New Mexico kind of desert story. I had an image that was very inspirational that was over a friend's desk, a photograph of 3 women on mules outside of a teeny tiny brand new built town that was at the foot of a mountain. And there's the mountain and then this tiny row of brand new built structures that were the town, and then 3 women on the outskirts. And that image of the the scale of it. Yeah. Scale of the tiny human endeavor next to the vast landscapes. And then we just started scouting in Montana, and we just arrived in this place, and it was just exquisite. It was perfect. And we had a location, we had a scout plan that was supposed to, start in Montana and then go all over, and including to Arizona. And we just got to Montana, to this town called Red Lodge, and near the Beartooth Pass, and just was like, this is it.
It's breathtaking. That location of Mary's wedding, that location that takes place. It really is heart-stopping when you see the clouds. Yeah. I so appreciate the skies in this movie. Skies are such a key factor in making great Westerns, I think. It's why Cimino's Heaven's Gate works so beautifully, because he took the time, maybe more time than he did.
That's a movie I love also.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. It's a fantastic film. And
that's on my list.
Good one.
Yeah.
So yeah, that location of the wedding and of the actual Ruby City town is just, it's flawless.
Thank you.
And Matt and I are also big fans of the rare Westerns that actually have a part that takes place in the winter. And I always find that winter Westerns, or even Westerns that are set not in Arizona, you actually get a sense of the changing of the seasons and the kind of cyclicality. You get a sense of, I guess, time. Did you know that you wanted that to be a part of the movie?
No.
Or that's just a happy accident?
It's a happy accident. I mean, we got there, we started prepping and it snowed on Labor Day. and as it does in the West, in the mountains, right? It snows and then it snows and then it's summer in the afternoon. Yeah. And my producer came to me frantically and said, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are we going to do if the whole movie's in snow? And I just said, don't worry, it won't be. And I said, whatever it is. I mean, that's kind of, I've had good weather karma with my movies, and I think it's because I surrender to the weather. You can't fight the weather, and particularly in the mountains. So, but we were lucky. After that snow melted, we had exquisite Indian summer for half the shoot, and then it all really went with the look of the movie. And we weren't into like real cold winter. We finished in the middle of November, and we weren't into real bleak winter until the end of the shoot, which you can kind of see, when she rides off to fight the bad guys.
Yeah.
Where were you living? Like where's the crew staged? Do you have to bring all this equipment in every day, or do you live right there?
We stayed in motels. There was Red Lodge is a ski resort.
I got it.
So there were motels, and we were, pre-season. And Montana was not that popular then. This was kind of before it really came into vogue.
I mean, this is around the time of A River Runs Through It, but I think
it was right after. It was right after,
right,
and
okay.
River Runs Through It had shot there the year before.
Yeah, so that was the film that really, if you were to ask Montana locals, they would say that film should have been called A Tourist Runs Through It, because that's what happened after that movie came out.
That's exactly right, and they shot in the same area the year before. Yeah.
Okay.
So in addition to these gorgeous locations that you picked, you also filled the film with these amazing production design in those locations. Can you talk a little bit about working with your production designer? The Ruby City mining camp just feels so authentic, and we get to see it grow throughout the film, which is such a treat.
Well, that's Mark Friedberg, who is now one of the greatest American production designers, and this was his second movie.
Amazing.
And, I interviewed wonderful production designers, all of whom could have done a great job. And I just, I met Mark, and he had, I think, done one movie before that, kind of small movie, contemporary college dorm thing. But there was just something about Mark. I just knew he was the guy.
Mm-hmm.
And, Mark, I think, agrees that Ballad stands with the best of his work over the years.
It seems so risky. Here's your first Western, and you're working with a very new production designer. I would have thought somebody would want to surround themselves with people who have built Western towns before, but it didn't work out that way.
I'm not that sensible. I mean, to be honest, I was interested in the vision and the sensibility. I had really good producers, so I trusted that he would have the support that he needed, that I could go with the vision.
I mean, to Matt's point, there are so many sort of striking moments where it is the production design that really emphasizes. I mean, to me, one of the most memorable moments is when, all of a sudden, I believe it's the bank is there, just fully formed amid the tent city, and it's red against the white. That's just such a striking moment that just symbolizes everything that's happening at that moment in the movie. It's such a wonderful image.
Yeah. Well, that was also designed with a shot in mind. I wanted, because that's a time transition. That's like 10 years later transition. And so I wanted the transition to come with, they go to the town and they may look the same, but you go around the corner and there it is.
There's
money.
Progress.
There's money.
Right.
Yeah, even seeing the way that the lettering of the cattle company is written up there and carved in stone. This is not going to be leaving. This is not just a wooden shack or a tent. This is permanent. So it's really beautiful. Also, the saloon, the way we see that saloon from the crappy, early, scary saloon that she first walks into, and then when they announce her death, we see it's become a legitimate saloon, and yet the same locals are just chilling out in the background. It's such a wonderful image.
Thank you. Thanks.
So the movie also includes a lot of animals. We've got this amazing number of livestock here, horses, those beautiful oxen, those shaggy-haired oxen, which are great with those massive horns. There's even a wolf sort of in there somewhere too. Plenty of sheep.
Dog.
Was the wolf a dog?
Yeah.
Well, it fooled me.
Amazing performance.
So what was
sound
that
effects will really, but don't tell him that we dubbed his yell.
So working with those animals, what was that like for you?
Well, we had really good trainers.
Yeah.
And you know from the work that I'm very interested in the texture and the landscape and the details of life, like the animals and the homemade quality of structures, all of that kind of stuff. So, it was part of the world. So, we had really good animal trainers.
Where do you even get those massive oxen? Like how did they show up one day?
I don't know where they came from. I think they...
Oh, it's Montana.
It's Montana.
Right.
I don't think they were probably that far away.
And when you're writing that in the script, are you thinking ahead of time, this won't be a problem, or are you just pouring it out?
No, you can't think like that. You won't write anything.
Did you, on the subject of animals, at what point did you know you wanted it to be about sheep herders? Because there's there's a minor tradition of Westerns about sheep, and sheep kind of being lesser than cattle.
Well, that's why.
Like Ballad of Josie and so on.
Right. That's why it was, starting out with what's easy and I guess, was easier and more manageable was sheep. Raising cattle was a bigger deal and came with money from the East.
They're also much funnier to watch. They're some of those scenes where
I fell in love with them.
She's wrangling them.
She's first figuring out how to work with them, and they're so stupid, and they've got their heads caught in things. It's hilarious. It's great.
Yeah.
The cows are kind of boring that way, so I think this was the way to go.
Good, thank you.
So the cast, of course, in this movie is just off the hook. Every role is filled by people who would go on to have these amazing careers, and starting, of course, with Susie Amos, who's brilliant in the title role. How did she come to your attention, and what was she like to work with?
Well, she was extraordinary to work with. I think this is where the 10 years of my acting training and growing up in watching New York theater come into, as well as movies, at that time, there was really there was no one who was bankable who would have really been good for the part. So we were looking at relative newcomers and just, had tons and tons of auditions in Los Angeles and New York, and nobody felt right. It just didn't. There were women who came in dressed as cowgirls for their auditions, and, Susie walked in and she just arrived from Paris and she had a pink bow in her hair, and she was just amazing. And, I just felt like she was my Jo.
Was there a certain quality that you were were you looking at as somebody who was, passable as a man, or a certain androgyny, or was there or is it just kind of ineffable? I
think the androgyny, there were women I auditioned who were very good, but who were just so, and it's funny because Susie is very feminine, but she's also androgynous. So there were women who auditioned who I just knew would never be believable. And even, even going with the conceit of that back in those days, you didn't have to do much except wear the clothes of the other gender to be misidentified, So, but I wanted Joe to be passable as a, young man. I think her talent, her androgyny, and her beauty. And she's also very, she can be very plain also.
Did you work with her on the voice to get that lower tone voice?
Yeah. Of course, she worked on that very, very hard. That was very hard for her.
Did she already know how to ride? Because she seems really
sure
good.
Did.
Yeah, she's great.
She looked great on a horse.
Yeah, when she's following Beau Hopkins crossing rivers and things, she just looks like she owns that horse. It's pretty good.
Yeah, she grew up in Oklahoma. She's an experienced rider.
Oh, that's awesome. The scene where she cuts her hair, is that a wig she's cutting, or? Oh, wow. So that's why. Yeah, it scares me every time I watch that moment. I flash to Ridley Scott making G.I. Jane when he had to have Demi Moore shave her head, and he had like 5 cameras rolling to make sure he captured that moment and there wasn't a problem. What was that like that day?
Susie has the most beautiful strawberry blonde hair, and at that time it was down to her waist.
Wow. Amazing.
And I knew, I just didn't feel like a wig was the right way to go with this movie, with this performance, and she was like, fine, I'll cut my hair, no problem. So that's all Susie cutting her own hair.
I love the scar, the scar and the haircut together really helps sell that. That and the hat. I'll talk about the hat later because I'm obsessed with Western hats. But that's my last question.
Well, that was the costume designer came up with the right hat.
Yeah. Well, I'll jump into it.
Because also,
case.
one of the challenges is like, with a role like this, is how do you make the person not look goofy?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you make them look believable? Like, what are the right clothes? And our costume designer did a fantastic job.
Yeah, the hat really worked because it's got that extremely wide brim that kind of keeps her in shadow all the time. Like she can use it and tilt her head down and you can't see anything. But it's also got this
Once upon a time in the West.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Like you have to,
Exactly.
It psychs you out. But it also has a really short crown that makes her look sort of diminutive in a way.
Well, it looks in proportion.
Right.
If she had like a big crown, she'd look goofy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought so.
One of the questions I always have for filmmakers of Westerns is what happens to that hat? Like, does that just go back to costumes or do you have it? Does she have it?
That's okay. It's a poignant question. I saved all of Little Jo's wardrobe and because it was all custom made.
Yeah.
Including her boots. The hat was custom made, and I've been schlepping it around for these 20, however many years. And I just moved out of a really big house where 2 years ago, where I was storing it. And I was like, I can't keep carrying this around, so I donated it. I gave it to the costume designer Ann Roth.
Oh wow!
Who
Great.
has a warehouse here. Her daughter lives in the same town I do in New Jersey, and we got connected, and I gave all the wardrobe to her warehouse, which she built and which is a cooperative with other costume designers. So,
amazing. What a gift. Wow. That's really a precious artifact there. And it'll be well cared for, I imagine.
Well, hopefully it'll be used. I don't know,
Get it on display in a museum someday.
I don't know, I mean, I don't think it's going in a museum, Andrew. But
I might have something to say about that.
But it's at least it's with wardrobe, and it will be well cared for instead of in my garage.
Great. So we've mentioned Beau Hopkins several times already, and he really is a force of nature in this movie. So what was it like to direct somebody who's been in so many Westerns, some of the best movies ever made? He
was a dream. He really felt that this part was a huge opportunity. He loved the material, and he was a dream. He's a consummate actor. He's superb. As you know from his work, his range is enormous. I don't know if you saw him in the few minutes he's in Hillbilly Elegy.
Oh, I haven't seen it yet. No, he's in that now. I'll definitely watch it.
He is a small part, but every minute he's on screen is just. He's amazing.
I'm a big fan of westerns of the 70s, and he's in so many of them. Not only The Wild Bunch, but Monty Walsh, Culpeper Cattle Company, Man Who Loved Cat Dancing, Posse. So to see him get a full role, to go from these small parts that kind of just really hint at this immense talent, to see him as a fully fleshed character with such complexity. It really, it's like the role of a lifetime in some ways for him, at least in terms of that.
I think he felt it was.
How cognizant were you of that kind of Western baggage is the wrong word, but his background.
That's why I cast him. I cast him because of the opening scene in The Wild Bunch, because of the bank.
Oh, he's marching them around the bank.
I cast him because he was wonderful, but it was because of his baggage that I cast him.
We have lots of conversations about these, more minor character actors who appeared in many Westerns who, we would just love to have seen them in a leading role. Matt's a big fan of Richard Jekyll. And this is the case. This is the case where it happened, where he actually got to really showcase his talent in a Western. And it couldn't be a more beautiful performance.
I would agree with you.
His costumes as well, that massive coat he wears, that kind of, he's already such a big guy, and it just fills him out. He fills a doorway when he walks in. It's really beautiful. He's also brings that, he was always such a menacing character in so many ways in early films, and I was kind of scared of him the first time I saw him. And he has that at the beginning of Little Jo in that bar scene. You don't know if this is setting up to be the villain. He seems hair trigger violent at any point. Then we slowly fall in love with him and find him kind of charming. But we see that never goes away, because a few scenes later, he's threatening to cut the throat of Tin Man. So he really is a full person.
The moment where Joe learns and we learn that he has a wife. Like, there's this moment where you're like, oh my goodness, there's this entire life beyond the kind of the archetypal character that we encounter in a conventional scenario. And our response is Joe's response in that moment. Like, oh, wait a minute, there's more to this guy.
But, if you go back and look at all the movies that you love and think about the men like that in those movies, most of them had a wife and 10 kids at home. Right?
Exactly.
Which have been left out of the story.
Right.
But they did.
His final moments when he's feels so betrayed by one of his best friends. And then that moment when he finds the photo, it's just such a beautiful moment. When you're filming that and you're watching him do that, it's all silent too. He's just raging at the room like Orson Welles and Citizen Kane, knocking things around. Yeah, what's going through your mind when you're seeing that?
Oh, it was just, it was one take, and it was his last scene, and and it was just like he said, I am so angry, I want to break stuff. And I said, you can break stuff, but we have no seconds, we have no doubles, so just know it's one take. But I'm fine with you doing what you want to do. Yeah, I think his performance is exquisite, and the complexity of it, of being that kind of, that man who we see often very one-dimensionally in movies. He captured the one-dimensionality in a complex character.
Right.
Really beautifully.
Now, another actor who, of course, has a strong connection to the Western is Renee OBrien, who everybody knows from McCabe and Mrs. Miller. He's in that small, colorful role at the beginning of the film. It was great to start off with him. Now, when you have him in the film, do you get stories from him about shooting McCabe, or is
he only shot for one day?
Oh, really? So he was just in and out.
He was very busy. It was the beginning of
Deep Space Nine.
Yeah.
Right?
It was
Star Trek series.
Very, very. He had just been cast in Star Trek. It was just starting, and he was like, that's my annuity, and which I'm sure it was.
Then, of course, there's Sir Ian McKellen, who was quite new to American audiences at the time. How did he come to your attention?
It's only his second movie, actually, and his first American movie. I don't know if you remember back then, he was touring the United States in a production of Richard III that was being hailed as one of the great performances. And he had also just come out as gay, and he'd been knighted. So there was kind of a small storm around him. And actually his agent contacted our producer and said, what do you think about Sir Ian McKellen to play Percy? Was not my idea, but it was a brilliant idea.
Did you adjust the role to fit him?
Well, we talked about it. I mean, the role, there were, the conversation when we met, he said, how are you going to get me into my role? And I said, well, what if the character is someone who is gay but unaware of that and all those feelings and can't live that way? And he became instantly interested. And but it wasn't so much, I didn't direct it that way. His presence brought that to the role.
Oh, that moment when he teaches her how to smoke a pipe is my favorite moment, maybe in the movie, when he's
how to be a man.
Yeah. And that quiet moment where he says, now close your eyes, hold it in, and think about your future. What a beautiful line. I mean, that's just such an exquisite moment. And you hold on it, and the lighting, the candle light, I think that scene is lit with a candle.
It is.
I mean, I don't know what to say.
And then there's Declan Quinn.
Right. Had he already been making films or shooting films before?
Declan shot The Kill Off.
Oh, okay, right.
That was his first American film. He also was new. He'd made a film. I think he'd shot one feature in Ireland. He'd come out of music videos.
His work with natural lighting is just gorgeous. That and the candlelight scenes are just perfect.
Yeah.
In the cast, we also have David Chung as Tin Man Wong, who's really terrific in this movie. I imagine that might have been a difficult role to cast.
It was almost impossible at the time. There were so few working Asian American actors, so few. And we did a really broad call, just kind of looking all over the place. And we were coming up empty. And I think it was not long before we left for location. I was sitting in the producer's office, and this fax came in on the fax machine, stuttering in on the fax machine with his 8x10, and I'm looking at it coming in upside down, and I went, that's him. Yeah, he really did a beautiful job.
He really brings a lot of heart to that film. And
really, I mean, also as an actor, he had actually stopped acting because there were no good roles. He stopped after, what's the Alex Cox film he was in?
Repo Man.
Yeah, that's where David had been in that, and there were just no good parts. He'd quit acting, and I think his agent had heard about the movie finally and sent that, or former agent.
I can see where that would be a difficult decision to make on his part. I just literally, this wasn't planned. Last night I was watching Chuck Norris's Missing in Action 2 from 1985, this crazy Vietnam action film. And
I want to ask you why.
I don't know. I go off on some weird rabbit holes. And boom, there's David Chung as the sadistic prison guard at a POW camp. And yet he stole every scene he was in. I mean, he was the villain you love to hate in this crazy, bizarro movie.
Well, and like the Frank Badger character, this is another one of those sort of archetypal, one-dimensional characters, even more marginalized than most Westerns, who you actually give screen time to, and we see this. That's
the whole premise is, when I was writing and I knew I wanted Jo to fall in love, her arc is that by bearing a disguise, she gets to become her true self by having an outward disguise. So it's like, who is a man who's invisible in the Western landscape? There you go.
Yeah, immigrant laborers.
The immigrant laborer are totally invisible. So they're both, that's how they get that's the whole premise. That's how they escape detection. They're invisible.
So one of my favorite elements in the film is the score by David Mansfield. And as a lifelong Michael Cimino fan, I have to confess I am obsessed with David's music. In fact,
do you have your props there, Matt? Oh, there they are.
I'll tell him.
On vinyl right here.
Oh, I'm sorry, he's not home. He's my husband, right?
Yeah.
Not home, but I'll tell him.
So you met on this film.
And I hired him because of the Heaven's Gate score.
Yeah, it's one of the most beautiful scores of all time.
I agree with you.
It's a masterpiece, really.
I agree completely.
So do you work with somebody that talented on what you actually want, or did you just say, give me what you're good at?
No, we worked very closely, actually. That's how we got the opportunity to fall in love, as we were working together. No, because I wasn't that experienced. I needed to work with him and he needed to work with me. It wasn't as exquisite as Heaven's Gate is. It's pretty much monothematic, right? Most of the score is derived from the folk song, the Slavic folk song that's used. And, what David spins with it is incredible. I knew I wanted him to use all acoustic instruments and I didn't want orchestra. I wanted to keep the scale of the score very intimate. No, we worked very closely together, actually.
Now, he acts in Heaven's Gate as well. Was there any chance of getting him to act in your film as well?
There was no interest in getting him to act in my film.
Wasn't ready to lace him up again?
You didn't want to have him roller skate through the scene?
So. I don't think so. And really, who could top that? We didn't have our whole budget would have been that skating rink.
So another thing that the film has in common with Heaven's Gate is that it addresses the immigrant experience in America during the 1800s. So at what point in the script writing process did you know you wanted to include that as a subplot in the movie?
It evolved as I was writing from images of Russian immigrants or Slavic immigrants that I found. I was like, oh, yeah.
It's such an unexpected moment when it comes in, and yet it makes perfect sense with another group of outsiders coming into this area. I particularly love that moment where Jo shares the orange with the family. I watched it with my girlfriend the other night, and the orange reminded her of Little House on the Prairie, where in those books, the family would get an orange for Christmas every year. That was
I didn't remember that.
Yeah, it was in their stockings, and it became like this bonding moment with the family, this one little treat. So it's such a charming moment in your movie. Another thing I'm curious about is the medical treatment that Ruth gives to Tin Man. Where did that come from? Is this based on actual folk remedies? Or?
It's all everything is based on real stuff, Right
down to the drinking of the kerosene, which is just one of the, I even find it hard to watch having seen the movie, a dozen times.
Yeah, they used to give it to babies too.
Oh, no.
Yeah, but all the herbs and the poultices and the tar.
Yeah, it's all from books on folk remedies.
Right. But that's the kind of, what I love about that scene is how in so many Westerns there are, there are like interesting jars on shelves in stores. And here we actually see them opening the jars. And
that's what comes of having women in the store, you see, because men don't open the jars, women open the jars. That's what we do.
Yeah.
Or did in the West,
Yeah.
Right. We filled the jars and then we opened the jars.
So getting back just briefly to Declan Quinn, when you were working out how you wanted the film to look, did you use other Westerns as reference points? Did you watch things together?
Yeah, we did. I mean, the main references were McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Heaven's Gate. There was a film that the title, fabulous regional indie film that the title, you two will probably know the film I'm talking about. It was based on a true story. Rip Torn was in it. He's phenomenal. He plays this rancher out in the West who sends for this woman to come and be his wife.
Oh, Heartland.
Thank you.
Heartland, right?
Yes, exactly. Heartland, right.
It has Conchetta Farrell.
Farrell,
right.
Farrell. Yeah. And Rip Torn. And who's the director?
Richard Pierce.
Oh, okay. There you go. But it's based on the female character's actual diaries of being a mail order bride and then going. And there's some incredible images in there, particularly really, really, really wide shots to really, that really kind of take you into the loneliness and isolation of being in this vast country. And
at the same time, So the film isn't shot though in, like 2:3:5. So could you talk a little bit about too big?
Yeah, I felt that would be too big.
Right. So too epic for an intimate film like this.
Yeah. Kind of one of my philosophies is I've always had to work within a very modest budget. And I think it's really important to not, to make that so that it doesn't crush you.
Right.
That's something that also affects the casting, that I cast, wonderful character actors and, don't cast stars who would, the scale suddenly tilts. But we talked about it and I just felt it would diminish the movie rather than creating a feeling of the isolation and the vastness. I felt that it would diminish the movie.
Yeah, I think people talk a lot about widescreen with the Western, but they sometimes forget that, VistaVision, for example, wasn't 2:3:5. The Searchers isn't 2:3:5. No. It's about the aspect ratio of the Ballad of Little Jo. So.
Yeah. And, and 1:3:3 kind of wasn't in style then anymore. Yeah. Really, it wasn't bright, I mean, I loved what you said about Meek's cutoff and, Kelly's use of the bonnets. I wish she had made that. I mean, it's an visually exquisite film. I wish she had shared with us that was where it comes
It's subtle.
From,
yeah.
Rather than, I'm not that subtle.
Yeah.
As you know.
So compared to other Westerns of the early 90s like Unforgiven and Tombstone and Young Guns, there's not a lot of overt gunplay in the film, which makes the scene where Joe actually kills those two cattle company killers seem so much more powerful. The look of anguish on her face after she shoots that last one and the tears running down, it's really striking. Was that something you wanted deliberately to keep so small there?
Yeah, because that's at the time I felt that that's sort of the journey is if you're gonna take the privilege of being a man in your disguise, the moment's going to come where you have to pay the price, which is to take a life in kind of the lore of the Western, right?
That's the law of the West.
So I felt that was her arc. And it was not a story for Gunplay, it's
right. Yeah.
It's not a shoot 'em up.
I mean, certainly in a lot of Westerns in general, but around that time, there's a lot of characters talking about violence and, the effect it has on people, but we don't actually really see it affect characters in the way that you see Joe in that moment, recognize the gravity of taking a life.
Remember, Joe came out like 5 minutes before Tarantino burst on the scene with, ears being cut off and the whole, the descent into ultra gratuitous violence. And
right.
So Tombstone has, there's a lot of like posturing and stuff and Unforgiven is, pretty harsh. But, I was telling a different kind of story.
I heard when you actually put the film together that the initial cut was like...
It was 10 minutes longer. Yeah, it was 10 minutes longer. And the current cut is much better, to be honest. I mean, one of the things that because I write and direct, I think one of the biggest challenges always is what do you need in a script that you don't need in the movie? Mm-hmm. Right? There's a lot of material. So, just to give you an idea, you get in the editing room and these scenes are really wonderful, but then the film is meandering, really. And, it was sort of unfortunate that it got finished at the 2 hours and 10 minutes and then shown to people and then we went back. But I don't feel like anything was cut that I regret, There was, for instance, a scene with the Russian family where the mother, has one more baby and sort of flips out and tries to kill the baby.
Oh.
So there was stuff that just didn't relate anymore to the story of Joe's journey. It was sufficient to come back, 10 years later and there's multiple grave markers,
right?
Yeah,
like that told the story. I didn't need the scene.
Yeah, those transitions are so. We talked about one before with the cattle company, just so judicious and impactful that just in those images you tell the whole 10 years.
I see a lot of films now that I feel are not finished being cut. I'm sure you would agree. That
absolutely.
And some of that, I think, just comes from digital editing and the haste of schedules, that there's no gestation time,
right?
As well as kind of different sensibility.
Well, you have so much more footage to work with now, too. I mean, just 10, 20, 30 times as much as you might have had 2 decades ago.
Right.
So, you can't help it. That can't help but affect the pacing, the decisions.
So now, as beautiful as the movie is, the marketing campaign from Fine Line Features didn't really do anybody any services. What happened there? Can you tell me? Do you know?
Well, yeah, I can tell you. I mean, and Ira Deutschman is still a friend. He was the head of Fine Line at the time. He and the head of marketing, I felt, really misunderstood the potential market of the film. They thought the potential market was people who go see Westerns. And I assure you that me and the producers went in and spoke to them after they cut the trailer that looked, because the film, if you're going to try and market it as a conventional Western, it's going to utterly fail, because that's not what it is. It's not a shoot 'em up. It's ridiculous. So, unfortunately, they didn't get that. They felt that this was the way to market it, and there was nothing we could do about it. I think it was very, very unfortunate, and I think it was terrible misunderstanding. And I remember, actually, Susie and I went down to do interviews for a radio show in Washington, D.C., and it was a call-in show, and I was talking about the film, and this woman called in and said, I went to the movies last night and saw a trailer for your movie. She said, I'm listening to you now, and I want to run out right now and go see your movie. But I was in the theater last night, and I saw a trailer for it, and I was like, I'm never going to go see that film. That was terrible.
Oh, no.
Oh, wow.
She said, it just, like, as a woman, the trailer was not cut to appeal to women.
Right.
It was cut as a cowboy movie for men. So it was, very misunderstood, unfortunately, by very smart people.
So the film rightfully earned a stellar review from the New York Times. I read it again last night, and it's really it's a love letter. And yet several other critics, far too many, seemed unusually angry at this movie when it came out. From your perspective, can you talk about what that was all about? Well,
I mean, we understand it now as fragile masculinity, but this 27 years later, we have language for that. No, I was stunned, actually, because the film is it's such a gentle film, and is so, I think the ways it portrays men who live among men are accurate or truthful, and not, but I think because the film was made by a woman, I mean, men portray each other much more savagely than I portrayed them. So, no, I was shocked and very disappointed. I think it was a very important awakening for me as a filmmaker to really understand how gendered representation is, and how important who is behind the camera is.
I find the response kind of perplexing in the sense that there were, to Matthew's point, sort of all these sort of mainstream critics who are basically criticizing the film for not being more kind of conventional, like Dances with Wolves, like Unforgiven. But then at the same time, there were also kind of critics in academia or in alternative presses. So, B. Ruby Rich's article, who were also sort of criticizing it for being too traditional.
She was very...
Not being about lesbian desire was her criticism.
Yes, I remember her review, and I just, again, we can have a different conversation in 2021. The film's about gender. It was never about sexuality, but I understand today why, someone representing the queer press would be angry that I'd co-opted a story that they would like to tell from their perspective. I understand that now, but the film's not about sexuality. It's about gender.
It's just remarkable to me how so many people were just projecting onto the film what they wanted it to be. And there's this kind of just, I don't know if it's an inability or unwillingness to deal with the film as a feminist Western.
Or just as a Western. I mean, I don't mind. I'm proud of the label feminist, and that film labeled me a feminist director and had, very profound repercussions for the rest of my career. Anyway, that's a different podcast.
I mean, I think that, and I've seen a lot of Westerns, and I'm pretty critical of people who talk about Westerns who haven't seen a lot of Westerns, and you've seen a lot of Westerns. And, to me, you did make a Western, because when the Western was at its peak, it wasn't about telling the same story. It was about incorporating stories from other genres and telling them in the West. And when I watched Ballad of Little Jo, I think of it as kind of a passing story. So, once upon a time, we told stories about African Americans who passed as white, or Jews who passed as Gentiles, and you could tell those stories in Westerns. And here was a kind of a passing narrative of a woman passing as a man, and it was in the West. And that's what the Western was. It was telling many stories in the West. And I think that what's unfortunate about the time that this came out is people, because of the other films, had been conditioned and hadn't seen Westerns for a long time into thinking the Western is this one extremely narrow thing, this one extremely narrow set of concerns.
I think that it also relates in a very big way to privileged male ownership of genre, of voices. It's because I did experience a similar thing with The Kill-Off, actually. Right. And so my perspective always it is defined as a feminist perspective, but to me, it's just my human perspective is women were there. Why wouldn't we have stories?
Has there ever been any talk now about, revisiting it for an anniversary screening or event or anything like that?
The good news and the bad news is that the rights have reverted to me. I own the film.
Oh, you do? Okay.
But there's no digital transfer of it.
Oh, right.
And so there's the money required for all of that. But if you know of a distributor, a streaming company that would be interested, I own it.
Wow.
Okay.
I've gotten more requests to talk about it, or, it's bubbling right there, right now.
And I would also say that I've shown this film to many students now, and I can tell you that it has inspired young women filmmakers to go on and make short Westerns of their own.
They're in the right location for it, that's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's shown in a lot of, as you probably know, it's shown a lot in colleges and universities in film history and history of the Western classes.
Yeah, the scholar Jim Kitsis, who's one of the major scholars, wrote a very...
There's two essays in his book about...
Yeah, about it, and that's a textbook that's assigned. So I think that, that's the ticket. You get written about in a textbook that gets assigned a lot, and that's the way to get your film shown.
His essay's a love letter also. It was really...
It is.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, he calls it an exemplary postmodern Western for anyone who wants to look up the reference.
So, Maggie, I just want to thank you again for joining us today on the show to talk about your movie. I hope it's clear from Andrew and I how much we admire the film, and it's just a great entertaining movie too. It's like holds you for the entire 2 hours. It's paced beautifully. So I can't say enough about it.
Well, obviously it's a work I'm very proud of, and I'm really grateful that there are actually so many people out there who love the film and who are keeping it alive. So, and I love talking about it. So thank you for inviting me. It's great to meet you both.
Pleasure.
Throughout history, society has driven women to make difficult decisions in the name of survival.
Here she is, boys! Come and get her! You're mine now! Give me my money! I sold her to you fair and square!
Some have chosen surrender. Some have chosen escape.
We'll find you!
And some...
It's against the law to dress improper to your sex.
...have made the boldest choice of all. Joe Monahan went searching for a new life.
Many different sorts of men come here, and most of them leave the same.
And found a world she never dreamed of.
You know, you're about the most mysterious person who ever came to Ruby City.
I see Mary's eyes follow you. Will you be courting her?
No. Tonight's the night you've been waiting for.
I don't think so.
Little Joe, I think you should reconsider. A man can get diseases, he don't do it regularly. Little Joe, you are the unfriendliest fella I ever met. And frankly, quite peculiar.
What do you think would happen if they found out about me?
You made a fool out of me, Josephine.
Little Joe Monahan turns out to be a woman.
I'll keep my promise, Josephine.
They'd kill us. You don't, Percy. I'll find you, and I will kill you.
The Ballad of Little Jo, a film by Maggie Greenwald.
Well, that wraps up our show. Until next time, I'm Matthew Chernoff.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, and you've been listening to How the West Was Cast.
Well, that was our show. We thank you kindly for listening and hope you'll come back again real soon. Till then, keep your saddle oiled and your guns greased. We'll be seeing you.